And we wouldn't recommend necessarily doing a dysphemism drinking game.
Jeff, let's talk about some of the rhetoric that's being used by politicians and media to describe the situation that's unfolding in Ottawa right now.
Yeah, Dan, I think we may have on our hands, we may have an instance of, or several instances of something called doublespeak.
Ooh.
So by doublespeak, what we have is the intentional use of language to distort or misrepresent an event or situation. So there's a couple things that are involved in doublespeak. So it sounds Orwellian. It's not a word that actually appeared in Orwell's 1984. It's kind of a mixture of newspeak and doublethink. But some examples that make it a little bit more, let's say, tangible and realistic and less fictional sounding would be euphemisms, and then the opposite of euphemisms, which are dysphemisms.
Okay, what's the difference between those?
So euphemisms being a choice of language to make something unpleasant seem more pleasant, and a dysphemism making something neutral seem unpleasant.
Okay.
So I think what we may have on our hands here is potential examples of dysphemisms in the coverage of the Ottawa protests. Let's
go through some examples then. I have here a news article from Global News, and the title is Trucker Convoy, Ottawa Under Siege Amid Nationwide Insurrection, Officials Say. And they have a link here to a video from a meeting of some civil servants. I think it's the Police Service Board of the City of Ottawa. You can find it on YouTube. I just have a few clips, and the first one is of one of the councillors, Deanne Deans, speaking. Listen to this.
We are on day 8 of this occupation. Our city is under siege. This group is emboldened by the lack of enforcement by every level of government. They are terrorizing our residents, torturing them with incessant honking, threatening them and preventing them from leading their lives. People cannot go to work or open their businesses. They cannot sleep, walk, shop, go to medical appointments, or enjoy their neighborhood. This group is a threat to our democracy. What we're seeing is bigger than just a City of Ottawa problem. This is a nationwide insurrection. This is madness.
Okay, so some very interesting terms here that she uses. So she says uses terms like under siege, occupation, terrorizing, torturing, threat to democracy, and nationwide insurrection.
And we wouldn't recommend necessarily doing a dysphemism drinking game during the first part of that speech. It may not be good for your health.
That's right. Yeah, and if it only stayed in just a meeting like that, that would be one thing. But of course, it's bled out into the broader media. And so I have a clip here from City News.
The nation's capital is being characterized as a city under siege.
Right, so you have city under siege right away at the beginning of that report. And we can go to other news reports. I have one here, CTV News. Doug Ford, so he's the premier of Ontario, calls Ottawa situation an occupation. And then here's the Wall Street Journal. This is one that you sent to me, Jeff. Title, Ottawa fears vaccine protest has morphed into an occupation. And then actually there's a subtitle here that says police are considering military help.
What else would you do with an occupation, right?
Exactly. Here is the New York Times. Ottawa residents fed up with truckers' noisy and intimidating occupation. So you have these words like occupation and siege being used. And I find those very interesting because for me, they conjure up thoughts of a military incursion and a military taking things over. And we can look at the definitions themselves. So for instance, here's the definition of occupation from Merriam-Webster. And what you find are things like the act or process of taking possession of a place or area, the holding and control of an area by a foreign military force, the military force occupying a country or the policies carried out by it. So you have in the third definition here, definitely a military type connotation. And if you look at the word siege, again, in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says a military blockade of a city or fortified place to compel it to surrender. So a military blockade. So these are very, I would say, maybe violent words, and they conjure up thoughts of war.
So to emphasize that, in the Merriam-Webster example for siege, if you look at the use of it in a sentence, you have insurgents rampaged through the countryside, sacked haciendas and mills, occupied small towns, and sieged, there it is, the largest cities.
Yeah.
So you get insurgents, occupation, and siege all being used in the same sentence to define or to illustrate how siege should be used in a sentence.
Yeah. And now the important point that we want to make here in this video is that the use of words matters. You can use words to change attitudes and also to influence people's actions, right? And so, Jeff, what's some research that we can bring to bear on this?
Yeah, so we actually have a really good paper, a really good psychological paper to show the effectiveness of dysphemisms and euphemisms to alter people's perceptions and evaluations of behaviors in terms of how appropriate or inappropriate they are. So the paper is called Controlling the Narrative, Euphemistic Language Affects Judgments of Action While Avoiding Perceptions of Dishonesty. And something really nice that this paper does is actually make a nice distinction between the use of euphemisms and dysphemisms, distinction there between those techniques and lying. So the use of these techniques, they're not lies, they're not falsehoods. They're just, let's say, embellishments or twists or, manipulations of language to make something seem worse or make something seem better without actually lying.
Yeah, because again, those definitions that we mentioned, they included some benign aspects. So for instance, like occupation just means, being in some place, maybe taking possession, maybe a bit stronger. So maybe that's true of the truckers in Ottawa. They're just sitting there. They're occupying public space, I suppose. They're not disallowing others from using it, but you can say that they are. But then there's this other definition as well about military action, which is not the case in Ottawa, but yet when you use the term, people might think of this other aspect, more negative, more military aspect of the definition.
Exactly. So you take something that could potentially be quite neutral, let's say a protest, and you make it very negative. Namely, it's a rowdy protest or that's not really dysphemism, but you can make it negative and say it's an occupation, or instead of somebody being a protester, they're an extremist.
Yeah.
Or they're a terrorist.
Yeah, we could think of what's going on in Ottawa and describe it as a peaceful protest, a democratic demonstration, a freedom rally, and those are certainly the terms that maybe the truckers would want to use. But you see here government and media using different terms.
Right. So you can have rally, we can have demonstration, we could have protest. And then on the other hand, you can have occupation, insurgency, siege. Yeah. So there's quite a divide with those choice of terms. So a conclusion from the study, they found subtle linguistic manipulation, such as doublespeak, exemplifies a potentially harmful real-world attempt to shape the beliefs of others through the strategic use of language. The current study suggests that people's evaluations of actions can be predictably biased by the strategic use of euphemistic and dysphemistic terms in an act's description. This is especially true when people possess some degree of uncertainty about the act, event, or idea they are evaluating. So we get some recognition that the more you know about something that's happening, the less affected you're going to be by euphemisms or dysphemisms, but you could still be affected by them. They are quite powerful, even though they're subtle.
And just in terms of method here, so participants in the study were presented with statements about a person's actions, and they were either framed in a euphemistic way, more positive, or a dysphemistic way, more negative. And then the participants had to rate how much they agreed with the person's action in the statement. And one example, do you have an example there?
Yeah, there's multiple examples. We'll give a few here just to illustrate the difference and the illustration of euphemisms versus dysphemisms. So we'll use one that's very apt for the current situation we're trying to apply this to. Mitchell, a political extremist protesting outside of City Hall. So
That's a dysphemism.
How much would you agree with that, let's say, that action? Versus Mitchell, a political activist protesting outside of City Hall.
That's more euphemistic.
That would be the more euphemistic language, right? Other examples being Ben inviting a hate monger to speak at his university, or Ben inviting a provocateur to speak at his university. So which one of those would be more or less acceptable?
Yeah, so you're much more likely to agree with a provocateur than a hate monger, and that's what the data show in this study. Yeah, very interesting. And Jeff, this links back to some older work by Loftus and Palmer and others. Loftus and Palmer was 1974 when they were looking at how language influences memory. The title of the paper was Reconstruction of Automobile Destruction, an example of the interaction between language and memory. And in this study, people watched videos of car accidents, and then later they were asked to estimate the speeds that the cars were going at when they, and here they use different words, either smashed into each other or bumped into each other or hit each other. And what they found was that people recalled the cars going faster when the word smash was used than when these less violent words were used, like bumped or hit. And maybe even more interesting was the finding that people were more likely to falsely recall the presence of broken glass that wasn't even present in the video when the word smashed was used to describe the incident and when the word hit was used to describe the incident, right? So again, you can change memory. So you can imagine going to Ottawa, seeing what's happening. Later, you come home and then you're asked about it, and you're asked about how violent were the protesters at the rally, and then that might actually shift your way of thinking about the rally itself. It's kind of striking.
Yeah, if you were to see the news coverage talking about the terrorism, the torture, the insurrection, the insurgency,
exactly,
that may alter your perception
and your
of
memory.
An event you were just a part of, or you may have just witnessed yourself. Interesting.
Yeah, and not only can the words influence your attitudes, but they can also influence your judgments about what actions ought to be taken. And I'm thinking of a paper actually cited by the first paper that we talked about. It's authored by Fauci and Boroditsky, 2010, and is titled Subtle Linguistic Cues Influence Perceived Blame and Financial Liability. And in that study, they basically framed a situation in either a agentive way or a non-agentive way. So for instance, an agentive frame would be she flopped her napkin on the centerpiece candle. She had ignited the napkin, right?
So she under her control. She did it.
She did it, yeah. And a non-agentive frame is her napkin flopped on the centerpiece candle. The napkin had ignited. So it's all about just the napkin somehow.
The napkin did it.
The napkin did it. Yeah. Yeah. She did it versus the napkin did it.
The napkin started the fire versus the woman started the fire.
Yeah. And here's what they say. This is in their abstract. Agentive descriptions led participants to attribute more blame and request higher financial penalties than did non-agentive descriptions. Okay. So both blame and penalties. And so I want to just make the key point that the words that are used could have these very important consequences because they might conjure up thoughts about how we ought to deal with a situation. So if you frame the happenings in Ottawa as an occupation and a siege connoting some military action, then naturally you would say the response to that ought to be a heavy-handed response by government, maybe even by military. We actually saw that being suggested in one of those articles that we mentioned earlier.
And another important thing to emphasize is these dysphemisms, they don't get registered as lies.
Yes.
They're subtle and they're not registered as outright lies or falsehoods. which
Yeah.
makes them very tricky and very effective.
That's right. Yeah. And when you're using terms like occupation and siege and insurrection, it's really conjuring up a particular response and maybe even preparing the population for a kind of a response.
Right. What kind of response do you expect to see to a nation's capital being occupied, being under siege?
Well, you'd want a military defense of the nation's capital.
You'd say, why hasn't it happened yesterday?
That's right. Yeah.
That's very, very interesting.
So the main message here is that words matter. They can change your attitude, but they can also change your action, or at least the extent to which you would agree with a certain action. And we have to be very aware of this because we always want to be on the lookout for manipulation. Because, hey, this is the Manipulation Check podcast.